I was 64 years old, twice divorced, and sitting alone in a bar in Cebu when Evangeline Reyes smiled at me like I was the only man in the room. I should have known better. After 32 years in banking, I'd spent my entire career reading risk, evaluating trust, spotting the numbers that didn't add up. But none of that training meant anything the moment she looked at me with those dark, careful eyes and said, quietly, almost like a confession, that she had never been with anyone before, that she had been waiting, that she believed God had been saving her for someone worth waiting for, and God help me, I believed her. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. It always does. I retired from Lloyd's in the spring of 2 years ago. 32 years of service, a decent pension, a house in Taunton that felt like a museum to 2 failed marriages, and absolutely nothing to look forward to on Monday mornings. My first wife, Patricia, left when our children were still young. She said I was emotionally absent, and looking back, she was probably right. My second wife, Judith, lasted 11 years before she found someone warmer, someone who came home before 8 in the evening. I couldn't blame her either. I had been a man built entirely around function, work, targets, performance reviews. I had never really learned how to be soft with anyone. When I retired, my son James, he was 31 by then, living up in Edinburgh with his partner, told me I should travel. He said it with that careful, diplomatic tone he uses when he's actually saying something else. What he meant was, go somewhere far away from your regrets and try to figure out who you are without a title. He was right about that too. I booked a flight to the Philippines because I'd read something online about Cebu, the warmth of the people, the coastline, the pace of life. I had no plan beyond that, just an open-ended ticket and a vague idea that I needed something I couldn't name. I arrived in April. The heat was something I hadn't prepared for, that particular heavy heat that wraps around you the moment you step off the plane, the kind that makes everything feel slightly unreal. I checked into a hotel near the waterfront, unpacked my single suitcase, and sat on the balcony watching the city move. It was loud and alive in a way that Taunton never was, never had been. I felt out of place in the best possible way, like I had accidentally stepped into someone else's life, and for once, that felt like a relief. I found the bar where Evangeline worked on my 4th evening in the city. It was not the kind of place I would normally have gone, slightly dim, slightly too loud, a mix of tourists and locals nursing their drinks in comfortable silence. I went in because it was raining and I didn't want to go back to the hotel yet. I sat at the bar and ordered a San Miguel, and that's when she appeared. She was 26. She had long dark hair pulled back loosely, and she moved behind the bar with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing the job long enough to make it look effortless. She smiled when she set the bottle down in front of me, and it was a real smile, or at least it looked like one. She asked if I was traveling alone. I said I was. She said that seemed peaceful. I said it was, mostly. And that was it, nothing dramatic, nothing rehearsed. Just a conversation between a tired old Englishman and a young woman doing her job. I came back the next evening. And the evening after that, by the second week, we were talking every night. She told me about her family, her mother, her 2 younger brothers, her father who had died when she was a teenager and left them with very little. She told me she had been raised in a strict household, that her mother was deeply religious, that she had been brought up to believe that certain things, intimacy, commitment, love were sacred and not to be given carelessly. She said she had never had a boyfriend, that she had watched her friends give their hearts to men who treated them badly, and she had decided she would wait, that she was 26 and still waiting. I sat with that for a moment. I remember looking at her and thinking that it seemed almost impossibly rare. I said something like, "In this day and age, that takes real conviction." And she looked down at her hands, a little shy, a little careful, and said, "I just want it to mean something when it happens. I want to be sure. I want to be honest with myself and with you about what happened inside me." When she said that, I felt something shift. Not just attraction, I'd felt that from the beginning, but something deeper and more shameful, if I'm being truly honest. I felt chosen. I felt like a man who had spent 32 years being functionally present and emotionally absent had stumbled, at 64, onto something that felt like grace. She was waiting for someone worth waiting for. And somehow, Sitting on that bar stool in Cebu in the rain, I began to wonder if that someone might be me. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I know. We started meeting outside of her working hours. Coffee in the mornings, walks along the waterfront, long conversations about everything and nothing. She was curious in a way that charmed me. She asked questions about England, about banking, about what my life had looked like before I came here. She seemed genuinely interested, and I was so starved for genuine interest that I opened up more than I had with either of my wives. I told her about Patricia and Judith, about James and my daughter Sophie, who I spoke to too rarely and regretted it constantly, about the quiet loneliness of my retirement. She listened to all of it with the kind of focused attention that made me feel visible in a way I hadn't been in years. She introduced me to her mother, ailing Nina, about 6 weeks in, a small, serious woman who lived in a modest house in the northern part of the city. She served me rice and fish and watched me with careful eyes across the table. Evangeline translated some of our conversation, and at one point her mother said something that made Evangeline look down and smile. I asked what she said. Evangeline told me her mother said I seemed like a good man, that she could see I would take care of her daughter properly. I remember feeling a warmth in my chest so strong it almost embarrassed me. I told myself I was being sensible. I told myself I was taking it slowly. But the truth is, from the moment she told me she had never been with anyone, I was already gone. That single piece of information had done something to me that I am not proud of. It had made me feel like I had a purpose again, like I could be, for the first time in my life, someone's first and only. I had been nobody's first anything. Patricia had dated widely before me. Judith had been engaged to someone else before we met. I had spent my whole life arriving somewhere after someone else had already been there. And now here was this young, beautiful woman telling me she had been saving that part of herself, and I was the one she had chosen to stop waiting for. I told myself I was in love. I think I was, but I was in love with the story she was telling me more than I was in love with the actual person standing in front of me. I didn't know that yet. We became official her word in the 3rd month. She stopped working at the bar, which she said was because her mother didn't think it was appropriate now that she was in a serious relationship. I didn't question it. I was paying for our outings anyway, covering most of her expenses. It felt natural to support her while she figured out what came next. The first significant request came 4 months in. She told me she wanted to start a small business, a beauty salon, the kind that were common and profitable in the city. She had a cousin who could help her run it. She knew the area. She had a plan. She needed £85,000 to get it started properly. I converted that figure in my head, thought about my pension, thought about my savings, and then I looked at her face and thought about the way she had said my name the first time, like it meant something, and I agreed. I wired the money within the week. 5 months later, she told me she wanted to take a business management course at a private college. She'd been doing research, she said. She wanted to run the salon properly, to understand accounts and marketing and management. The course cost £95,000 when you factored in materials, fees, and a laptop and other equipment she'd need. I hesitated slightly this time. I asked some questions. She answered them patiently and then got very quiet, and when I asked what was wrong, she said she just hoped I still believed in her the way she believed in me. That quietness, that soft, injured withdrawal, it did something to me every time. I wired the money. At month 10, she told me her family was in serious difficulty. Her youngest brother had been unwell and missed months of school. Her mother's house was deteriorating. She needed to help them. It was her responsibility, she said, and she looked ashamed even saying it. The figure was £140,000. I remember sitting in my hotel room. I'd moved to a serviced apartment by then with my laptop open and looking at my account balance and feeling something close to vertigo. But then I thought about ailing Nina serving me rice across that table, about what it meant that Evangeline had chosen me, about the fact that I was a man with savings and no one to spend them on, and she was a woman who needed someone to believe in her. I wired the money. I want to stop here and tell you something about the man I was during those months, because I think it's important. I was not a fool in any conventional sense. I was a retired banker. I had spent 3 decades assessing financial risk. I could read a balance sheet better than most people read a newspaper. And yet I gave this woman, Over the course of 18 months, 510,000 pounds. Not because I couldn't count, not because I didn't notice, but because every time I began to notice, something happened that pulled me back. A conversation where she cried and told me she had never felt so safe with anyone. An evening walk where she held my hand and said she used to pray for someone like me. A moment quiet, careful, lit by the soft blue light of the apartment when she looked at me and said that she thanked God every day that I had walked into that bar in the rain. These things happened. They were real moments. Whatever was false about Evangeline Reyes, those moments felt entirely real, and I chose them over my instincts every single time. The house request came at month 14. She wanted something of her own, not a rental, but a property. She said she was tired of feeling like she had nothing permanent, nothing to show for herself. She wanted to feel stable. She wanted us to feel stable. The figure was 190,000 pounds. By that point, I had given her 320,000. My account was bleeding steadily and I knew it. I told her I needed time to think. She said she understood. She went quiet for 3 days, and in those 3 days I slept badly and moved around the apartment like a man with a low-grade fever, and on the 4th morning she sent me a message that said simply, "I know I asked too much. I'm sorry. I just wanted a life that was real," and I wired the money. The total, by month 18, was 510,000 pounds, more than $500,000. My entire retirement savings, the proceeds of the house sale I'd done after Judith left, everything I had built across 32 years of disciplined, careful work, gone. And I want to tell you that at the time, at that point, before I knew what I know now, I did not feel like a victim. I felt like a man who was finally doing something meaningful with his money. Like a man who had found, against every reasonable expectation, a reason to spend what he had saved. That is how thoroughly she had rearranged my understanding of what was happening. Evangeline told me she was pregnant at month 16. She was calm when she said it, sitting across from me at a cafe near the water, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She said she hadn't been sure at first, that she'd taken 3 tests before she believed it, that she was nervous, but also, she smiled here, small and careful, happy. She asked how I felt. I said I needed a moment. I looked out at the water. I was 64 years old and about to become a father again. And the first thing I felt, to my own surprise, was not panic, but something almost like joy. It was insane. It was completely, thoroughly insane. But I had invested so much of myself in this story, had shaped my identity so completely around being her protector, her first, her chosen person, that the idea of a child felt like the next chapter of something I had already committed to fully. I told James over the phone. He was quiet for a long time and then said, "Dad, are you sure about all of this?" I said I was. He asked if I'd been careful with my finances. I said I was managing things fine. He didn't press. But I could hear the worry behind his restraint, that careful, diplomatic concern he'd inherited from me. My own doubt began, not with a revelation, but with a small and almost accidental moment of seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. It was a Thursday evening. Evangeline had left her phone on the kitchen counter when she went to shower, and a message came through not from a name I recognized, but with a tone that was unmistakably intimate. A Filipino name I didn't know. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't snoop. But I saw the notification, and I saw enough of the preview to understand that it was not a message from a cousin or a friend. It was the kind of message that exists between people who share something private. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. The shower was still running. I stood there and I thought about the number 510,000, and I thought about the word virgin, and I thought about how carefully and completely that word had changed my behavior from the very first night she said it. And something in me, the part that had spent 32 years reading Risk, went very quiet and very cold. I didn't confront her that night. I needed to know more before I said anything, because I had learned in banking that the worst thing you can do when you suspect a problem is act before you have the full picture. I needed the full picture. What I found, over the following 2 weeks, I found through a combination of careful questions, a local contact I trusted who helped me do some basic checking, and a conversation with another Western man I'd met at the gym, an Australian named Gary, 58, who had been living in Cebu for 4 years and who looked at me with an expression I didn't fully understand when I started describing my relationship. Gary put down his water bottle and said, "Tell me again how you met her." I told him. Bar worker, claimed to be a virgin, strict religious upbringing, business loans, education fund, family assistance, house purchase, pregnancy. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "Mate, how much have you given her?" I told him. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without getting angry at me." He told me he knew 2 other men, both Western, both retired, both significantly older, who had been involved with women in Cebu, using variations of the same pattern: the virginity claim, the strict upbringing, the escalating financial needs. The pregnancy that appeared once financial investment was deep enough. He didn't know Evangeline specifically, but he knew the shape of what I was describing, and he said it was not uncommon. He said it was, in some circles, considered a professional arrangement. I drove home from the gym that day and sat in the apartment for 3 hours without moving. The full picture came together in pieces over the following days, and each piece was worse than the one before. Through my local contact, a man named Ray, who worked in property and had lived in Cebu his whole life, I learned that Evangeline had been in at least 2 serious relationships before me, both with older foreign men, both involving significant financial transfers. I learned that she had not been working at the bar for the first time when I met her. She had worked there for years, had left briefly, and returned. I learned that the business, the college course, the house, none of it had been set up the way she'd described it to me. I learned, through a source I won't fully describe, that at the time she told me she was pregnant with my child, she had been actively involved with at least 2 other men, both foreign, both sending money, both operating under the same belief that they were special, chosen, the first person she had ever truly loved. I learned, most painfully of all, that the story of her purity had never been true, that the careful shyness, the gentle religious framing, the detail about waiting for someone worth waiting for, all of it had been a constructed performance. She had been sexually active since she was a teenager. She had never saved herself for anyone. The story existed for one reason: because it worked, because it transformed ordinary attraction into something that felt like destiny, because it made men like me lonely, aging, hungry for significance feel chosen in a way that bypassed every instinct we had. I confronted her on a Wednesday evening. I had planned what I was going to say. I had notes. Actually, I am still a banker at heart, even when my heart is the thing being accounted for. I laid out what I knew, calmly, systematically: the other men, the previous relationships, the lies about her past, the money. She let me finish. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She sat very still across from me, and when I was done, she said, in a voice that was completely flat, "You believed what you wanted to believe. I didn't force you." Then she picked up her bag and walked out. I sat in that apartment for a long time after the door closed. I could hear the city outside, the noise of Cebu, the traffic, the distant sound of someone's radio, and I felt something I can only describe as the particular silence that exists when a story ends and you haven't figured out yet what to do without it. Not just the story of Evangeline, the story I had been telling myself, the story where I was the man who had finally done something right, who had finally been someone's first and most important person, who had found love and purpose and relevance at 64 in a bar in the rain. That story was over, and the truth underneath it was not a story at all. It was just a set of transactions. There is a man named Tom Pickering who lives 2 floors above me in the building where I'm staying now. He's 67, former school teacher from Dorset, been in Cebu for 3 years. He's the one who talked me through the worst of it, not with advice, just with presence. He'd sit with me in the evenings sometimes, and we wouldn't always talk about it. We'd just sit, and that was more valuable than most things people said to me. James flew out to see me 2 weeks after the confrontation. He sat across from me in the apartment and didn't say "I told you so," which I will never stop being grateful for. He just asked me what I needed. I told him I didn't know. He said that was fine. He stayed for 10 days and helped me start working through the financial picture. It was as bad as I knew it would be. My pension was still intact, thankfully untouchable, structural, mine regardless. But the liquid savings, the house sale proceeds, the investment accounts I had carefully built over decades, most of it gone. Not all of it, but most. The pregnancy. I need to address this directly. I don't know. I genuinely don't know if there was a pregnancy, and if there was, whose it was. Evangeline never contacted me again after that Wednesday evening. She did not respond to any messages. The local contact, Ray, told me some months later that she had resumed working at the bar. I don't know what happened with the pregnancy claim. I suspect it was not what she told me it was. I think about it sometimes, in the particular way you think about a thing you cannot resolve and cannot forget, and I let myself sit with the uncertainty because there is no alternative. Sophie called me from Australia, where she lives now with her husband and 2 young children. She'd heard from James. She was careful with me. The way she has always been careful with me, she is more like me than either of us finds entirely comfortable, and so our conversations have always required a certain amount of care. She said she was sorry this had happened. She said she loved me. I told her I loved her too, and I meant it more clearly than I had in a long time, and I think we both noticed something shift in that moment. Loss does that sometimes. It clarifies what's left. I have been in therapy since March. A British therapist named Dr. Helen Marsh who does sessions online, which means I can stay in Cebu for now without losing that support. She has been helping me understand something that I resisted for a long time, which is that Evangeline's deception was sophisticated and deliberate and designed to exploit very specific vulnerabilities in men like me, but that I am also responsible for the choices I made. Those 2 things are not mutually exclusive. She was predatory. I was also desperate in ways I had not acknowledged, hungry for a kind of significance I had never managed to build in my real life, and willing to trade my financial security for the feeling of being someone's most important person. That last part is the hardest part to sit with. Not the money, though. Losing that much money is not a small thing, and I will spend the remainder of my retirement more carefully and with considerably less comfort than I had planned. But the money is gone and it cannot be recovered, and I have made a certain peace with that, the way you make peace with any irreversible fact. What is harder is the truth about why I believed her. I didn't believe her because I was stupid. I believed her because I wanted to. Because the idea of being someone's first after 64 years of arriving everywhere second was more seductive to me than any amount of financial caution. I let that want override the part of me that knew how to read risk. I let it override everything. There is a particular kind of grief in being complicit in your own deception. It is different from being straightforwardly wronged. It sits differently in the chest. It requires a different kind of reckoning. I am still in Cebu. People find that strange. Why stay? And I've thought about that question more than I can tell you. The answer, when I'm being honest, is partly practical. My costs are lower here. My pension stretches further, and London in the rain feels like a memory of someone I no longer am. But it's also something else. I think I stay because leaving would feel like I was running from the truth of what happened here, and I've done enough running in my life. Running from Patricia, running from Judith, running into retirement without a plan, running into Evangeline's story without looking clearly at what was underneath it. I don't want to run anymore. I want to sit here, in this city where I was so thoroughly and completely remade, and understand what happened, and become something steadier. I still walk along the waterfront sometimes, in the early evenings. The light at that hour is something I've never seen anywhere else. Golden, almost amber, the kind of light that makes everything look like it belongs in a story. I understand now why it fooled me. This city, at that hour, looks like the setting for exactly the kind of story I was telling myself. A second chance. A chosen man. A woman who had been waiting. None of it was true. But I was there. I was real. The hope was real, even if everything it was attached to was not. And I think that has to count for something, not as justification, not as comfort exactly, but as the simple fact that I had not yet given up on myself when I walked into that bar. I was still capable of hope, still capable of opening up, still capable of choosing to be vulnerable at 64 after everything that had happened before. Evangeline Reyes used that against me. She saw it, and she used it, deliberately and skillfully, and without regret. But it was still mine. The hope was mine, and I can decide what I do with it from here. I spoke to James last week. He told me he was proud of me for getting through it, for not falling apart completely, for going to therapy, for staying honest about what happened. He said, "Dad, most men would have shut down and refused to talk about it." I told him I had spent enough of my life shutting down. He laughed a little, quietly, and so did I. And it was the first real laugh I had managed in months, and it felt like something loosening in my chest. I am 64 years old. I am a retired banker from Somerset. I have 2 adult children I don't see enough of, and a pension that will sustain me and a wound that will take years to fully close. I was deceived by a woman I believed in completely, and I gave her more than £500,000, and I will never see any of it again. I was manipulated through a lie about purity that was crafted specifically to make me feel like something I had always wanted to be. The first, the most important, the chosen one. And I let it work. That is the truth I carry. Not with shame exactly, I am past shame, or trying to be, but with the particular, heavy knowledge of a man who finally saw himself clearly and did not entirely like what he found. I wanted to be a savior. I wanted to be special. I wanted to matter to someone in a way that felt different from the ordinary mattering of daily life. And she knew that, or sensed it, from the first night I sat down at her bar. The lie about the virginity was not really about the virginity. I understand that now. It was about what the virginity represented, the idea that someone had been saving their most precious thing for a person exactly like me. It was a story about my value, and I paid £510,000 to keep believing it. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you this because I think there are men out there, good men, lonely men, men who arrived at the later years of their lives feeling like they had missed something essential, and they are walking into bars in cities like this one. And there are women waiting who understand exactly what those men need to hear. And I want those men to know, the most dangerous story is the one that tells you exactly what you've always wanted to be true. Be careful what you're willing to believe. Be careful what you're willing to pay for a feeling. And be honest, more honest than I was, about what you're really looking for when you get on that plane.